Plato believed that democracy was the second worst system of government ever devised by man. The worst, he said, was tyranny. And here is what haunted him. He believed one always becomes the other. Not by conquest. Not by invasion. But from the inside. Slowly. Willingly. Almost eagerly. He called it the natural decay of freedom, and he wrote about it 2,400 years ago. And it reads like he was watching the news this morning. Plato was an Athenian philosopher born around 428 BC. He is perhaps the most influential thinker in the history of Western civilization, and that is not a small claim. He was the student of Socrates, the teacher of Aristotle, and the founder of the first institution of higher learning in the Western world, the Academy in Athens. But Plato was not just a philosopher in the abstract. He lived through something. He watched his teacher, Socrates, the wisest man in Athens, the most moral man he had ever known, put on trial, condemned, executed, not by a king, not by a tyrant, by a democracy, by a vote. And so when Plato wrote about democracy, he was not theorizing. He was grieving and warning. Around 375 BC, Plato wrote the Republic, one of the most debated books in the history of human thought. Most people know it as the book with the cave allegory. The prisoners chained to the wall, mistaking shadows for reality. That part is famous. But buried inside the Republic is something far more unsettling, a complete theory of political collapse. Plato argued that governments don't fall randomly. They fall in sequence, in a pattern, in a predictable, almost inevitable progression. Aristocracy decays into timocracy, ruled by honor-seekers rather than the wise. Timocracy decays into oligarchy, ruled by the wealthy. Oligarchy decays into democracy, ruled by the many. And democracy decays into tyranny, each stage collapsing into the next not because of war or plague but because of something in human nature itself. That was his argument, and he made it with the precision of a surgeon. Now Plato did not hate the idea of freedom. That's the thing people misunderstand. He wasn't a tyrant's philosopher. He genuinely understood democracy's appeal. He'd lived in Athens, the birthplace of it. He had seen what freedom could look like when it was working. The debates. The open assembly. Every citizen with a voice. That was remarkable. That was genuinely new in the world. But Plato asked a question that no one wanted to ask. What happens when freedom becomes the only value? What happens when tolerance and equality stop being virtues and start being the answer to everything? When every restraint begins to feel like oppression? When every boundary feels like tyranny? When the very idea of discipline starts to seem like an enemy of the people? Plato said, something breaks. Not all at once. Gradually. The way a rope frays. In the Republic, Plato describes a democratic society with this image. A city of color and motion and noise, where every desire is considered equal, where no one is obligated to anything they have not chosen for themselves. He calls it the most beautiful of constitutions, the way a coat of many colors is the most beautiful of garments. It sounds like a compliment. It isn't. Because in that beauty, Plato says, there is no hierarchy of values. The serious and the trivial sit side by side. The wise man and the fool have exactly the same platform. And slowly. This is the key, slowly, the democratic man himself begins to change. Plato describes him in intimate detail. He is a man who spends one day in philosophy, the next in drinking, the next in exercise, then in idleness, then in political passion, then in apathy. Each impulse is honored equally. None is ever mastered. And Plato says, this is what freedom, unguided by reason, produces. Not a citizen. A consumer of experiences. Someone who has every liberty and no direction. Now here is where Plato's argument becomes genuinely disturbing. He says that in a democratic society, the hunger for freedom eventually turns against the very structures that made freedom possible. Teachers lose authority over students because authority itself has become suspect. Parents lose authority over children. Laws lose their force, Not because they were repealed, but because people simply stopped feeling obligated to follow them. And then something remarkable happens. The people who are willing to say uncomfortable truths, the ones who insist that some things matter more than others, that restraint has value, that not every desire should be indulged, those people start to look dangerous. They start to look like they want to take something away. And in a culture that has made freedom its only religion, that is the one unforgivable sin. Plato calls these people the drones. Not the wise. Not the good. The drones. The agitators, the flatterers, the ones who know what the crowd wants to hear and are willing to say it loudly and without hesitation. The drones begin to rise. And here Plato delivers his darkest insight. The tyrant, he says, does not arrive from outside the democracy. He is the democracy. He is its final, logical product. The tyrant is the man who speaks most passionately for the people. The man who understands their fears and their resentments and their grievances. And is willing to give those feelings a name and an enemy. He rises by promising liberation. Liberation from the elites. Liberation from the constraints. Liberation from the complexity that makes governance feel so exhausting. And the people welcome him. Because he makes it simple. They give him power. Willingly. Gratefully. And then, the people who helped him rise become the first ones he turns against. Not out of betrayal. Out of necessity. Because a tyrant cannot rule alongside people who remember what he promised. So what was Plato actually saying? He was not saying freedom is bad. He was saying freedom is unstable without something to anchor it. He believed, and this is the core of it, that a just society required the same thing a just soul required. Order. Hierarchy. Reason governing appetite. Without that, the soul drifts. And without that, a democracy drifts. Toward the loudest voice. Toward the simplest story. Toward whoever makes you feel that your frustrations are not your fault. Plato spent the rest of his life trying to describe what the alternative looked like. A state governed by people who had genuinely mastered themselves. Who had studied virtue, not just accumulated power. He called them philosopher kings. He knew even as he wrote it that the world would probably never produce them. But the standard mattered. Even if it was never met. And here is what makes Plato so difficult to sit with. He was right about so much. And also wrong in ways that matter. His solution, philosopher kings, rigid class structure, censorship of the arts, has been used by authoritarians throughout history to justify everything he feared. The cure he prescribed was sometimes worse than the disease. But the diagnosis holds. The observation that freedom without wisdom tends toward its own dissolution, that a population trained only to want more will eventually want someone to blame for not having it. That is not theory. That is history. Repeating. You don't have to read the Republic to recognize what Plato was describing. You can just pay attention. The exhaustion with expertise. The rise of figures who perform outrage better than they practice governance. The sense that the people who warn you are the ones trying to control you. That's not a new story. That's Plato's story. And it is old because it is true. He said democracy's greatest enemy was not an invading army. It was a citizenry that had forgotten how to want the right things. Not more freedom. Wiser freedom. Not louder voices. Better questions. Plato never got his philosopher king. His own attempts at political influence ended in disaster. He was reportedly sold into slavery once for offending a Sicilian tyrant. The man who mapped the fall of democracy lost his freedom to a tyrant. There is something almost unbearable in that. But he kept writing. He kept thinking. He kept asking the question that no comfortable society ever wants to ask. What are we becoming? Not what do we want? What are we becoming? That question is still here. It never left. And it won't, until we're willing to answer it honestly.